Good afternoon, everybody. Hello and welcome to this inaugural edition of BOSCA Presents, presented by Mammoth Sports Construction. My name is John Hartwell, and I am the designer behind Hartwell Studio Works, a sports branding shop serving the small college athletics market. BOSCA Presents is a monthly series of live webinar conversations featuring athletics leaders discussing topics of importance for the small college athletics community. Our topic today is surrounding yourself with great people, keys to hiring successful coaches and administrators. And we are joined today for this conversation by Tim Selgo and Jim Abbott. Tim is the retired AD at Grand Valley State University. He is a past president of NACTA, and he is currently a senior consultant with Athletics Staffing and Consultants. Jim is the current AD at Oklahoma City University and is the founder of the Business of Small College Athletics, also known as BOSCA. Audience participation during this presentation is very much encouraged. We'll have the opportunity for Tim and Jim to answer your questions during this presentation. Please enter your questions in the chat box. All of those chat messages will come in to me as the host, and I will ask them to our guests at different points during our presentation. A quick reminder that we are recording both audio and video, both of which will be available later on the web. This edition of BOSCA Presents is presented by Mammoth Sports Construction. And before we get started with our presentation, I'd like to invite Brian Morris, the Vice President for Professional and Collegiate Operations at Mammoth Sports Construction, to say a few words. Brian.
Thanks, John. Mammoth definitely appreciates the opportunity to be a part of this Zoom call. We've had a relationship with BOSCA now for about a year and a half. I personally have had a relationship with Jim Abbott and BOSCA for really, I think, since the second one that he had when I was the Associate Athletics Director at Oklahoma Baptist University. We love small college athletics. We think like small college administrators. We're full of a team of former athletes and former collegiate athletics administrators from JUCO all the way up to people with experience at the high level Division I. But we felt like this was a great topic. We're surrounding yourself with great people, keys to hiring successful coaches and administrators. We also believe that a very key to success for administrators is hiring the right partners for your projects. And so we want to be here as a resource to each of you on this call. If your university or college has any kind of sports related project, please don't hesitate to reach out. Give myself a call, shoot us an email. Love to come out to your campus and visit. That's actually what I'm doing right now. Pulled over for this meeting, but we're out of state visiting clients. And that's what we love to do, just come alongside, be a resource to each and every one of you. Between myself, Jeremy Capo, who is our Assistant Vice President, Tim Allen, who is another Assistant Vice President, we have over 55 years of collegiate athletics administrative experience. So we think differently. We understand some of your pain points. We understand what you might be dealing with on your campus and your community. And really our goal is to come alongside you to help make you as successful as possible. So again, thank you for the opportunity. Jim and Tim and John, thank you for allowing us to be here in front of this group, and I look forward to listening to a great call.
Great. Thank you so much, Brian, and thank you to Mammoth Sports Construction for their support of BOSCA Presents. So to get our conversation started here, we're going to kind of walk through the process of hiring those great people, those coaches and administrators for your staff. And we're going to start with the search. And I'm going to throw this first question to Jim Abbott. Jim, when you are, as an AD, when you're looking at an opening on your staff, what are the initial steps that you take to begin the process of filling that open spot? Do you have a process with the HR department? Is there a search committee involved? How do you handle communication with your team, with fans, with donors? How do you kick off that search process?
Well, John, thanks very much. And I appreciate your involvement moderating this conversation. And I'm really grateful to Tim Selgo. We're going to give you two different perspectives. I've been a longtime private university athletic director, and Tim's background is in the state institution. So we're going to have two different perspectives. I always reflect back to when I've started. I'm in my 19th year as an athletic director, and what I've really learned is that the people you surround yourself are just critical. those first steps for me, the first step always involves human resources. They understand the rules and regulations for hiring. They're going to be involved in the process from the very beginning. If it's a situation where it's a coach or an administrator that we're making a difficult decision to replace, they've likely been involved for, the weeks leading up to that. But the first steps really are communication. One, with human resources. If this position is a coach, then certainly there's going to be communication with the members of that coach's team. In certain cases, I will reach out to donors and fans to make them aware of what's going on, to try to be ahead of it. But the first step for me is really communicating. I don't often use a search committee. I've done that a few times in my career, but for the most part, in our case, it's a smaller group within the athletic department that's going to be involved in the hire.
Tim, your thoughts?
Well, I thank you for having me, Jim, and thank you all for being here. First thing I want to say is that I'm in year 5 of my post-athletics administration career as a consultant, author, speaker, teacher. And I will tell you that this discussion is normally a 3-hour presentation with my consulting clients. So I'll try to give you the highlights of my thoughts in each of these areas. But there are 2 concepts that I think that are critical before we even talk about process. And that is, as a leader, you have to understand this is job one. This is the most important thing you do, the people you surround yourself with. People make you successful in college athletics. The people you hire, and then your leadership in developing and mentoring those people to be the best they can be. Nothing is more important than that. So if nothing else, I think as a leader, you have to understand that this is the top priority. I would always tell my administrative assistant and my staff, they knew very well that on the list of priorities that you have every day, and I know you all have a lot of priorities, this would rise to the top. It is job one, therefore your time and energy must be devoted to it. The second thing I would tell you about this process is to never cut corners in the hiring process. Never cut corners financially or with your time and energy. Now, let me explain that a little bit. That doesn't mean you spend a whole lot of money. We're all in, non-Division I programs. We don't have that kind of money to spend. But I will tell you this, if it's a matter of spending an extra couple $100 in this process to get it right, do it. It'll save you money in the long run. If it means spending a little extra time and energy up front, do it, because it will save you time and energy in the long run. Quick couple of examples. In my 28 years in athletics administration, 8 at Toledo, 20 at Grand Valley, I can think of 3 occasions that when it came down to it, and we had our finalists in, it came down to an absolute tie between 2 finalists. I couldn't make up my mind. And in all 3 of those occasions, I decided to interview him a 3rd time. And I was fortunate at the time, I was within driving distance of these candidates, but I would have flown if need be, because in all 3 occasions, I drove and met those finalists halfway. So I spent an extra tank of gas, maybe a meal, and a half a day or a day in that process, but it was well worth it. So never cut corners. Anytime you want to hurry through the process, I guarantee you're probably going to regret it. So that's one thing about the process. The second thing that, as Jim alluded to, I've been in public schools my whole life. Now, since I've been in consulting, I've been working with a little over 30 schools. A majority of them have been small private institutions. So it's a different process. But if you are at a school that makes you jump through a lot of hoops in this process, as I was at 2 public institutions, you need to master that process. You need to make sure you understand it and are ahead of the game each and every step of the way. By that, I mean if a coach is possibly going to leave, if an assistant trainer is looking at another job, I would have my administrative assistant and I go to work on getting the paperwork ready. It's the electronic work now, but we would go about doing the things we needed to do, from getting a recruitment plan ready, the job advertisement ready, just the approval for the search, which is probably tough right now during a pandemic. But there were all kinds of steps along the way, from completing an applicant log to getting approval to interview, that I would give a heads up to my favorite contacts in our human resources office at Grand Valley. Those two ladies, I took them to lunch when I retired because they meant a lot to our success. I'd let them know it's coming their way. I need a quick turnaround. We've got to move, and we have to move fast. This was one process that I wasn't afraid to push others on campus on. You have to pick and choose that, of course, on a college campus. This was one that I would push people on because they knew the sense of urgency. When you have a coach and a team wondering who their leader is going to be, when you have an athletic trainer position open and you got practice starting in a month, you got to move and move fast. So that's one thing about this process that I thought was important. I want to spend a couple minutes on the search committee. Yes, we always had a search committee for all of our open positions at Grand Valley. One of the things that was critical whenever I would meet with that committee, the very first meeting, was I let them know they are a search committee, not a selection committee. I was the selection committee. I let them all know I'm going to be the one that has to live with this person, and you won't have to, but I will. And therefore, I'm going to make the selection. And I think that's important with your search committees up front, that they understand they're an important part of the process. They were there to help us search, to go through all those applicants, to narrow it down for those first round interviews, and then help us with the first round interviews to select those 2 to 4 finalists, whatever that may be. But from that point on, myself and my staff would do the selecting. As I think about that, another key concept, err on the side of interviewing more rather than less. Again, this comes down to never cutting corners. When all first round interviews at most places, I would assume, would be teleconferencing. We had a program called UVU at Grand Valley in the late 2000s that we went to. We started doing first round via UVU or Zoom, as you would today. Always err on the side of including more candidates rather than less. It's just a matter of time. And in the case of on-campus interviews, it may be a little bit more money, but let me tell you something. We have had a lot of great coaches at Grand Valley that were choice number 3. We had a couple people back out, withdraw, turn us down, whatever it might be. So always be on the side of including more rather than less. And then I would say, for me, it was important to keep the process as confidential as possible. That's hard to do today, real hard. But, if you have the right people on a search committee, keep the process as confidential as possible. When it came to hiring a head coach, I would keep the team informed of the process, which brings up a point, by the way. Our search committees were always diverse. I encourage you to make sure you have a very diverse group on your search committee. That was a requirement at Grand Valley, a public school. And we fortunately had a staff that was very diverse that helped us have a good diverse search committee. But I get asked the question a lot, do you include student athletes in the search process? And I very strongly would tell you that no, I did not include current student athletes in the process. I don't think that's a great idea at all. And I would tell our teams that. I would let them know that it's my job to find the next head coach. It's their job to impress the next head coach. It's their job to go to school, stay on top of their schoolwork, and get themselves prepared to impress the next coach. And I use the example when Grand Valley hired, I served under 3 presidents. Nobody at Grand Valley came and asked me to be a part of the selection of the next president at the institution. That wasn't my job. It was my job and the job of our athletics department to impress the next president and get them on board as quickly as possible. That's the job of the student athletes. Now, I would keep them informed of the process, confidentiality with the candidates, and keep them informed of where we're at. And I would tell the seniors, I'm going to work through you to communicate. It's your job to get everybody at a meeting when I want to have a meeting with them. Okay. The last point I would make around that, though, I did have a graduating senior student athlete involved in every search process, whether it's administrative staff position or a coaching position. I wanted a graduating senior or a very recent graduate. I wanted the student athlete's perspective in the interview process, absolutely. But they don't have a personal agenda anymore. And chances are a graduating senior is 22, much more mature. And the third thing is it really helps them in their job search. It's a great experience for them. And we always got great insight from our graduating student athletes. That always helped the team out to know we had a student athlete perspective, but we didn't have anybody with a personal agenda. And if it was a non-coaching position, I would have somebody from SAC serve in that role in those positions. So I threw a lot at you quickly because we are limited on time here, but those are the highlights of what I think are important parts of the process.
Hey, John, let me just add a few things to what
Sure.
you said and to kind of keep our conversation going, because I think the really important point there is understanding the process is critical. Understanding how your human resources department works and the steps that have to be taken, the I's that have to be dotted, the T's that have to be crossed is very important. Maintaining a good relationship with them, because when you need them, you're going to need them like immediately. And so taking the time to make sure that you're filling out every piece of paperwork and maintaining that relationship is critical. Those steps are the same regardless, whether it's a coach or an administrative position. Those steps are the same. From a time standpoint, a coaching search always has a little more urgency to it. You know, you have current students that are engaged and anxious. You have recruits that are engaged and anxious, and it just always feels a little more urgent. I have met, you know, the longer you do this, the more often you have to have meetings like this. But kind of like Tim said, I meet with teams and I say to them, trust me to find a great coach for you. And it helps that we've had a history of doing that, but without fail, I think when you look at a team, you know, you got 2 or 3 that are pretty thrilled the coach is gone. It just doesn't matter. There are 2 or 3 who think, yes, we got a new coach and now I'll be the star. And you got a handful that are pretty anxious and hey, wait a minute, you know, what's going to happen to me in this? So I tell them to trust me, and I tell them, look, in your life, in your professional life, which is what we're preparing you for, this is going to happen. Tim's example is a great one. I've had 3 presidents. I'm on my 3rd, and she has just announced her retirement. And I've yet to be asked to participate in that. So, you know, start to finish, the timeline on how long this lasts sort of varies. I know in Tim's cases, it probably takes a little bit longer. You know, a record for hiring and getting through this process might be 4 or 5 weeks if you just kind of get lucky. A couple of other things that I'll mention is that I'm honestly not a fan. You know, the old school approach to this would be that candidates encourage some prominent person that they know to call Jim Abbott. Call him and let him know, hey, Tim Selgo is a great guy. You need to hire him. And personally, I am not a fan of that. I cannot tell you how many times Bill Self has called me to add input on a basketball coach. And Bill Self is a native Oklahoman. He's a heck of a good guy. But the fact is, Bill doesn't really care about whether my team is successful or not. Bill is just trying to put in a good word for whoever. Honestly, there have been a time or two that I've cut Bill off and I said, Bill, before you say a word, I've got 3 people here that have your name down. And he'll sort of stop and say, okay, who are they? And I'll tell him the names and he'll say, okay, that's the one that you might be interested in. But I just share that kind of colloquially because just personally, those people I have a pretty close relationship with. I'm willing to take a call from them and maybe hear their thought. But in general, this idea of having a mass of people reach out to me is counterproductive.
If I could, John, I would concur with everything Jim said regarding that. It did not do candidates very much good to have all these people call me. That just wasn't something I was interested in. However, I was very interested in getting feedback from sources other than those that were on the reference list. I was very interested if I've got calls out of the blue. I had some great calls from alums out of the blue. I have, in fact, I have a story of that in one of my books because it mattered a lot in the hiring of a highly successful coach that we had. And I also, when I was at Toledo, we got a very bad call on a candidate and enough to really pay attention and do some detective work. And we found out, no, we don't want to hire that candidate. So I would say that it's more important to me to get feedback from sources other than those that are on the reference list. And at a public school, that can be challenging. We had to ask candidates, now, are you okay with us contacting people that are not on your reference list? We had to ask that question. And, if they said no to that, well, that didn't do them much good either in the process. So that to me is more important in finding out about candidates. Find sources other than those on the reference list.
I've got a question here. This is specific, directed to you, Tim. Have you ever dealt with a pool of candidates that you or your committee deemed mediocre at best? Is it worth reposting the position again if timing is limited?
Yes, I think the answer is yes in both cases. Yes, I've dealt with it. And yes, I would suggest that you think long-term and wait and work at getting a better pool of candidates if you don't have any candidates you think are worthy for your institution. We're all at different institutions. The quality of the pool can vary depending on your resources, depending on your location. But I started, timing might make that a necessity. I go back to when I was the head women's basketball coach at Toledo. Wow, 35 years ago. That's a long time. And I had my assistant coach leave in August. And I made the decision to wait until next spring. And I went a year without an assistant coach. We only had one full-time assistant at that time. And that year was, it was stressful. And I signed 6 kids that year. I needed a big signing class. And we did, and we got some really good players in that bunch. But it wore me out. However, I did the right thing because the person that I hired in the spring, Shelly Applebaum, was terrific. She went on to have a great career. She ended up being senior women's administrator at Bowling Green and Michigan State. And it was the right thing to do for the program in the long run. And I would suggest to you, err on the side of what's best for the long run rather than getting a process over. And I know that can be challenging. You might have to go with an interim of some sort that you're not real comfortable with, but think long term. That was always my approach in this process.
Let me throw one more question in here to the search portion of the program. Is there a difference when filling a coaching position or an administrative position? Is there a difference between a search for either of those two positions?
Yeah, I think I addressed this a little bit earlier. The process, the technical part of the process in terms of what the university expects for us is the same. I always feel a little more urgency, as I mentioned, with a coach. than what I do from an administrative standpoint. I think Tim mentioned earlier, things like trainers. And in my world, we really only have one sports information professional full-time. So I think there's always an urgency. I involve other coaches a little bit more in searches that we do from an administrative perspective. But otherwise, the primary difference for me is I just always feel a little more urgency relative to a coach because, often we just don't have a coaching staff per se. So I may not have a full-time assistant to run the program in the interim.
I totally concur with that because with their coaching position, you have a group of student athletes that want to know who their leader is going to be as well. So you have a little more luxury of taking a little more time with an administrative position. And I would generally always use that time. As I mentioned earlier, I would push for a sense of urgency in this process. But I would pick and choose when I pushed really hard. We went through the whole process. We went jump through all the hoops with every search. But as I would tell others on campus that would wonder sometimes how athletics can go through a search in 3 to 4 weeks is because we did it at hyper speed. We focused on, we made it a priority. And with administrative positions, if I had the luxury of a little more time, I would take that time. The other difference that I would tell you that I had was on the makeup of the search committees. I've always had a faculty member on our search committees, and generally it was our faculty rep more often than not. I had 2 good ones that had good judgment, but I might change that makeup and maybe add another faculty member, another community member, or another alumni rep on a search committee if it was a non-coaching position. And that's also where I would get SAC involved. I would have a SAC president or vice president, one of those people on a search committee for an administrative position and give them a great experience as well.
And let me remind everybody that if you do have questions, do please enter those into the chat box, and I will get those read to our guest here. So, gentlemen, as we move on here, let's talk about qualifications of candidates and the interview process. Tim, let's put this to you first. What are some of the specific qualities that you look for in candidates for openings? What is it that gets someone an interview?
Yeah, well, obviously credentials, you've all been through a million resumes, and over time, you know what to look for and what's important to you. I think that's important. What do you want as the leader? For me, as we went through this process and as we're looking at candidates, in general, I wanted people who would work hard and people of good character. All right. Now, we all may have different definitions of that. And maybe it's not easily defined, but you know it more when you see it. But by and large, people in our profession work hard, and people of character, an example would be, I didn't want to hire coaches where I was worried about compliance all the time. And in the process, if you're doing it well, and if you're asking the right questions during the process, and by the way, that's a whole nother hour conversation, in my opinion. That's key to this whole thing. What questions are you asking? If you're doing that well, you get a sense of things you might need to worry about. There are no perfect candidates out there for any job. There never has been, and there never will be. Okay. But you need to really closely scrutinize these people. Learn to make it a study of people. Find out about all of them as much as you can. And I would tell you that when red flags pop into your mind, pay attention to the red flags. At any time in my career, if I suspected something and I didn't pay attention to it, I usually end up kicking myself afterwards. So again, you're not going to find a perfect candidate. And part of this process is to know these individuals so that when you do hire them, you can help them develop in the areas they need developing, but pay attention to the red flags. And then the other thing I would say, and I'll let Jim speak, past success is the best indicator of future success. Past success is the best indicator of future success. It isn't always true, of course, but I think overall, when you're looking at candidates, find out what they've done and what success they've had. Now, for us in the non-Division I world, your head coaches that you're going to hire are probably going to be first-time head coaches. And so you need to find out about them as assistant coaches. Did they have success in recruiting? And, you know, the program they're coming from is important, especially if they've been an assistant in that program for quite a few years. I always give the example, when I was at Toledo in 1990, we had Nick Saban as our head football coach. We were his first head coaching job. By the way, there's a great article today, in fact, on ESPN.com on that year Nick spent with us at Toledo. And it took me down memory lane because I remember well every one of those stories. Read the article, it's very good. But when we hired Nick, he had been a defensive coach his entire career. As a coordinator, we hired him from the Houston Oilers at the time as defensive backs coach. And everybody at Toledo was looking for someone who was more creative offensively. And I said, folks, I think this is the guy. I think he's going to be really good. We didn't know he'd be as good as he is now, but we thought he was going to be very good. I go, but we're not going to get an offensive spread him out guy. I mean, it just isn't going to happen. He'd been a defensive guy his whole career. The first series of his coaching career, he talks about the game we won at Miami, his first game as a head coach. The very first possession we had, we handed the ball to Troy Parker, a running back, 8 straight times for a touchdown. I turned to my buddy behind me. I go, there's that new wide open offense we just hired. All right. But the point being is past success is an indicator of future success. Believe me, Nick had plenty of past success as an assistant coach that we could hang our hats on, and it turned out to be a pretty good deal.
Yeah, John, I would concur with Tim. I interviewed a coach in the last year, and I asked this coach about what they look for in recruits, and the coach said something. He sort of clicked off his fingers, 1 and 2, and he said, 1, high character, 2, high motor. As I reflect on this, and this is pretty much what Tim said, I think the character is just such a critical part of it. If you're going to rely on this person, and particularly in our world where you really have to hire coaches and you got to turn them loose to do their job, you just can't afford to have somebody that you're not sure about the decisions that they're going to make in terms of their commitment to the students on their team, their willingness to follow the rules and regulations of your association. I think the high motor is important because, look, you got to be super versatile to be a coach in a small college in particular. Raising money, balancing budgets, monitoring academics. I can't have somebody who's looking for that time off. Often in our conversations, we talk about work-life balance, and the fact is that it's pretty hard to have that balance. And if you're not gonna relate well to a world that at times will offer you absolutely no balance, then probably you're not the right fit for us. I agree with Tim that looking at those past experiences and those credentials and that past success is important. I think for me, often I have to try to relate that specifically to our instance. So I've hired a number of coaches that were formerly Division I, and they're high character and they're high motor and they're great people, but I've got to be able to discern whether or not they can relate to the fact that we don't have a Nike closet where you just go grab all the gear you want and do whatever you want. You can have Nike, but you got to pay for it, and your budget is pretty limited. So I think for me, really trying to be able to discern their flexibility. I think communication skills right off the bat are huge to me. If you can't figure out how to apply, how to complete our online application, then you're probably not right for us. Because, well, I'll agree, sometimes it can be tricky. It ain't that tricky. And your ability to communicate to your team, to communicate to our fans, to sell yourself to me in that process is really an indication of your ability to represent our university and your program out there in the world. So I think those critical areas for me, much like they are for Tim.
I'd like to add one last thing to this conversation. Jim used the phrase, the right fit for his institution. At the end of and I'm speaking of coaching hires now, at the end of the process, when it came down to making a decision, I always ask myself two questions. Now, I would always, once I made a decision, I would sleep on it. And if I woke up the next morning and I knew it was the right decision, that's when I acted and we went about offering the position. But before that, I would ask myself two questions. Is this person the right fit, a good fit for our institution? And would I want my son or daughter playing for this coach? Those are two important questions that candidates had to check that box in order to get hired at Grand Valley. Now, what is the definition of a right fit for your institution? You know, that's not always easy to define. Again, it's like good art. You know it when you see it. But I think the sum total of all your experiences at your school and in your community, you really get to know if a person is going to be a right fit or not. And even if a person, you may have some question marks about that, if they're the type of people that can adapt and become a part, make your institution, your community their home, then they're going to be fine. The example I like to give on that is Rich Rodriguez and the University of Michigan in football. I think Rich Rodriguez is an outstanding football coach, but he spent his whole career at West Virginia in the South. He wasn't the right fit for University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. You know, no offense if there's any Michigan grads on the Zoom meeting, but the arrogance level is pretty high in Ann Arbor, okay? And Rich wasn't the right fit. Conversely, an example would be Brian Kelly at Notre Dame. Brian Kelly was our head coach at Grand Valley for 13 years. He kept telling my friends, he's perfect for Notre Dame. He went Central Michigan, he went Cincinnati. You know, they ought to hire him. You know, he knows how to win football games. He's got a great personality, which you need at Notre Dame with all the different constituents they have there. And he's Irish and he's Catholic. For crying out loud, he drink Guinness with the good priests at Notre Dame. You know, you can't get a better fit. And it's turned out that to be true. So that's you as a leader have to determine are they a good fit? The second thing, would I want my son or daughter playing for that coach? You know, I think that answers a lot of the things Jim and I have just talked about. That as the leader, are you comfortable with this person taking over your program? And I think those are two important questions that were important for me anyway.
We've got a question here from our participants. How much emphasis is placed on X's and O's in the interview setting? And then how does that compare to how much emphasis is on the fit of the candidate to your school or department?
That's a great question. I will admit that for me, I don't spend much time in interviews, particularly with coaches, talking about what style. I'm not particularly worried about whether, you know, I mean, I never met a basketball coach who didn't answer that by saying, we're going to play up tempo, fans are going to love us, blah, blah, blah. In my case, I don't, and you know, in some sports, I don't know enough about it to ask a question about what style are we going to use in this sport or that. So I don't spend as much talking about the X's and O's and the strategy that is going to be utilized within the competition. I tend to focus more on every other piece of it, specifically recruiting and even discipline. You know, I want to understand from a prospect, have you ever let a player go? And if so, why? Do you have a list of rules that must be followed? And honestly, if the answer is yes, why? So for me, it's much more about every other piece of it than it is needing to understand their specific style.
Yeah, I agree with Jim. I guess, you know, I like to say great minds think like, maybe it's old minds thinking like Jim, that I agree with you all the time. I think there's always a balance of all the things that are important in finding the right person. I think style of play has its place in some searches, perhaps more than others. We had the good fortune to have a good run of success in several sports at Grand Valley, and I was probably reluctant to a completely new style of play if we had been doing well and had success. I think of a program, at the moment we're really good in women's soccer. Well, we weren't very good in the late 90s and early 2000s. We were very average, in fact, below average. And so I wasn't I wasn't too worried about style. I needed to find the right leader that could recruit better players. That to me was a high priority more than perhaps style. I don't care what style you play. You've got to have players that can execute it. And so recruiting was a higher priority for me in the process. Finding people that could recruit the best student athletes possible for your institution, to me, was perhaps even more important. But style came into play at times, but not as much as getting the right leader. Again, in the long run. In the long run, what's the most important thing for your programs?
Let's get one more question here into this interview section. Do you bring in donors into the hiring process, and do you worry to introduce them to a candidate that they may like but was not a good fit?
Want me to go first, Jim?
Sure, Tim.
I tended to have an alumni rep on our hirings, search committees. So yes, I did. But I didn't do it to a great extent. They're a little bit like the team. I kept them informed of the process, especially those that were important. On the other hand, this was my job. They hired me at Grand Valley to surround myself with the best people possible. So I didn't want donors telling me who to hire. I didn't tell them who to hire in their jobs. I will say on one occasion, it was in one of our football head coaching transitions. We had to move fast like you always do. We'd had success and recruiting was at its peak in late December, early January. So we had a Football Alumni Association board, and I called for a meeting with them. And I met with them on December 28th in the evening in our football center, and I just kind of informed them of what my thought process was and what was going to happen with the process. And the reason why I had them involved and perhaps not a lot of other coaching searches was they were instrumental in many of the things we were accomplishing at our stadium and the upgrades in our weight room, football center, and so on. And I felt a lot of loyalty to them. And generally, sport alums understand the process a little bit more than pure donors and those that aren't alums of the sport. So on occasion, I did perhaps when I felt it was important in the process.
Yeah, and for me, I really don't. From time to time, I'll have a donor, potentially a significant donor, that might reach out and share thoughts about a candidate. But in terms of inviting them to be part of the evaluation, I have not done that.
And I would say one last point, back to my point of never cutting corners. If that donor is a very important one for you, and we all have those, I would always keep that person informed of the process. I might give that person a heads up an hour or two before a press conference, for example. So, you've got to make that judgment call as the leader. Perhaps there's a balance there. I didn't have to worry about it when we hired an athletics trainer, but I may have with one of our coaching positions.
All right, so let's move into the last portion of the conversation here. And you've made your hire, and now we're going to transition that person into your department. Jim, we'll go to you first here on this one. What steps do you take to ensure that smooth transition of your new employee into the department and on campus? And in a related question, how do you continue to help that employee grow and prosper?
Well, we've developed over time kind of a process to do this, and I think it's really important to take care of the little things before they get here. Things like business cards, and even technologically these days, making sure that the computers are set up, that passwords, login information, so that right off the bat from day one, they have that access. Years ago, you didn't worry about that because all you had was a phone for the most part. But with our coaches, I think part of that early transition, if there are 2 or 3 areas that we really try to get them ingrained and connected early on, one would be admissions. We have a liaison from admissions that is assigned to athletics. That person attends all of our staff meetings. And so generally for a new coach, within the first few days, they're going to have a meeting with admissions. And they're going to talk about admissions requirements. They're going to talk about academic aid that's available, et cetera, et cetera. The other one for us is generally going to be financial aid. We similarly have a representative from financial aid that attends our athletic staff meetings. That is how important that area is to us. So we want to set them up early on with those relationships. Administratively, it depends on the area that the person works in, but if they're handling academics and compliance, then we're going to put them together with a registrar, and we're going to put them together with the provost's office. So I think really, the other important thing is that I have a regular schedule of meetings with coaches. So we have individual meetings every couple of weeks. We have staff meetings every couple of weeks. And what's really different for a new employee is that I reiterate as much as possible that they have 24-hour access. So they're not going to wait for a meeting. They have access continuously, and I'm going to try to build specific times that we're together to ease that understanding and to answer that list of questions that just inevitably is going to be created in the early going.
For me, making that smooth transition or developing a great orientation process for new hires, we got much better at it late in my career than I did early on. Early on, I was like many, here's your email, here's your keys, there's the lunchroom, now go to work and make us proud that we hired you. To the end of my career, we got a lot more specific and organized with that process. And we were forced to, over the years, organically, but I can remember distinctly in about 2012, we lost our head women's soccer coach, Dave Deaney, to the University of Iowa in late May. And so we had to hire a new head women's soccer coach. Practice started August 10th. This is late May. And by the way, we were back-to-back defending national champs. So there was a lot riding on this. We had to move at hyper speed. We had to do a very thorough and very good job. And we had 2 other positions we were hiring at the time as well. So we had a busy summer that summer. But the point is that when we hired Jeff Hostler, our current head coach, it wasn't until the end of June. And then he finally got on board early in July. And a month later, we're starting practice with this very important hire with a very good team returning too, by the way. We had everybody back with our goalie. And we had to do a great job of making sure that was a seamless transition. And so our entire staff, we had to commit in July, hey, we've got to set up all those appointments for Jeff, as Jim mentioned, with others on campus, meet everybody within our department during a time in July when it's, it's pretty laissez-faire in an athletics department. And so we learned then and we developed an orientation checklist for every new hire, who they needed to meet with, what questions they need to get answered. And so that happened, just organically for us. The second thing that I would tell you on making a smooth transition and helping your new hires with anybody you hire. As I said, you're probably going to hire first-time head coach at our level or people without great experience. The professional development has to come from you, the leader. You have to commit to helping those people get better. And that means perhaps a commitment in money, in helping them reach out to those in their profession, in their sport, whatever it might be. It doesn't, again, have to be a lot of money. I would sit down with every coach at the end of the season. You know, who do you want to go visit with? Let's plan this out. And I'll pay for your room and your mileage. You pay for your meals. You know, I wanted to make sure they had some skin in the game, so they took it seriously. But you have to commit and some dollars to that as the leader. That lets them know you're committed to helping them. That is so important in the long run. Again, committing to their professional development. That's a part of that smooth transition into your department.
Yeah, John, just to add to that, I think it's important for me to understand the goals and ambitions of our employees. Obviously, when you're interviewing, you ask that question, and generally people are going to say, gosh, I hope to be at Oklahoma City University for 5 or 10 more years. But that changes as people grow and develop. So I think my willingness to understand what it is they want to achieve, and more importantly, my willingness to commit to trying to help them get there. I think so many people in our positions are worried about folks developing the skills that would make them attractive for other jobs. Well, my goodness, if you're that good, then it's going to be great for my department. So in my case, I try to set that example. And part of the example is never being satisfied that I know everything. So to constantly have this desire to get better personally, I think too, as Tim mentioned, it's important that as I'm spending funds to go to professional development and participate, I want our coaches to do it too. And honestly, what I say to them is don't just be a member of the Coaches Association. I really want them to aspire to lead that association. It's good for them personally. It's great exposure for our university. And while there are lots of opportunities for us to grow together and me to impact that coach's growth personally, one-on-one, I think getting out and doing what we're doing today, getting with a group of others to understand how they approach the challenges they face is important. I think more schools, and it's challenging now with what we're dealing with the pandemic, but I just think schools ought to prioritize that development, and not with any fear that I'm going to make this person so good that they're going to leave. Because if they're that good, you're gonna benefit from it.
I'll make one last point, John, then turn it back to you. When it came to administrative staff, and then depending on how large of a staff that you have, your staff may be very small and limited, but with a non-coaching position, I always felt it was important to get my staff involved at the conference level and at the national level on committees. I think that's great professional development for them. In our case, it was the NCAA, maybe the NAIA for some of you, but get involved with your conference, get involved at the national level, exposes them as leaders to grow and develop in itself. So I would always encourage that. Even if it meant time away from us and our department, that was great for their development.
And as we come into the top of the hour here, I've got one more question here from our attendees. This is to both of you. Do you both keep a short list of candidates just in case of a quick turnaround?
Tim, I'll start on this one. I guess the answer is in some cases I do. We have 22 sports, and some of these sports, one of the real challenges is just the depth of outstanding coaches. I'll just say, for example, with cheerleading or rowing, the pool is limited at this point. So Yeah, as we're competing, I'm watching those teams that we're competing against. I might see an outstanding team, but look at a coach who stomps around and doesn't represent the school particularly well, and that certainly impacts my opinion of whether or not that person would be somebody that I would consider. I will just tell you that I always, 99.9% of the time, open the position up. If we have a longtime assistant who seems to make a lot of sense, I still want to open the position. I still want to see that pool, because regardless of what my short list might look like, there's somebody out there that I don't know about. And probably one of the most successful coaches I've hired was somebody that I had never heard of. And I opened the position and got a look at their credentials and realized, holy smokes, this is somebody I have to talk to.
You know, I would answer that by saying I was always looking for prospects, whether I had the proverbial short list or not. I don't know if I ever had a piece of paper with names written on it for every position, but I was always looking for prospective coaches and or administrators. May have been in my conference work or national level work, or going to games and seeing other coaches in action, or programs that I respected. I wanted to watch and study them. So I was always looking for prospects, whether I had a short list or not. You know, one of the beauties in athletics is we have a grapevine that's very active. It's not very accurate at times, but it's very active. When you have a position open, people tend to know about it. But I was always looking at possible candidates. There's people in the Zoom meeting that I had as potentials in my mind at some time to keep an eye on, I guess is a better way that I would call it, is to keep an eye on prospects. The other point I would make on that is, don't overlook the people you currently have in your department either. And I'm thinking mainly of assistant coaches. We have some outstanding head coaches at Grand Valley today. There's 4 or 5 of them that were assistants for us that we specifically groomed to be the next head coach, to keep continuity in the program. Stability is really important in college athletic success. So don't overlook assistants you have in your program. They may not be ready right now, but think long-term. 5 or 6 years from now, can we get them ready to be the best prospect we can have for this position? So that's the other thing I would encourage you to consider, finding the best people you possibly can. They can come from anywhere.
All right, and as we are now heading into the top of the hour, that will bring the conversation to an end. Thank you to both Tim and to Jim for their time and expertise here and sharing their insights into the hiring of the successful athletic staff. Thank you to Mammoth Sports Construction for their sponsorship of this event, and thank you to everybody here on the Zoom call for making the time to be here and to hear this conversation. If you would like to get in touch with either Tim or Jim, oops, I'm sorry, I did that entirely wrong. How's that for a technical snafu? I'm going to recover real well right here. Here we go. If you'd like to get in touch with either Tim or Jim, you can get them at this information that is being shared on your screen right now. And before we wrap it up, I'm going to turn it over to Jim Abbott for some final remarks. Jim.
Yeah, John, again, thank you to you for moderating. Tim Selgo and I have the opportunity to work together in consulting, and he's just the best. Tim, I'm grateful that you took the time to be here today. I just want to tell the group that I'm as disappointed as you are that we won't have an opportunity to come together in person this year. So in lieu of that, my intention is to have some monthly sessions. Our next session is going to be October 20th at the same time, 3 o'clock. Kevin DeShazo is going to be the featured guest and presenter on that event. I would ask that you reach out to me if there are topics that you'd like to see discussed or areas that you want to be involved in. I hope you'll reach out, but more than anything, I'm grateful for your participation today and really grateful for what you do in your position and for our profession. And we look forward to seeing you again in about a month. So thanks again.